Um, I think we'll get started. I'll do a little introduction so that we'll give more people time to come in before Sam gets started anyway. Welcome everyone. My name is Fatma Anwar. I'm the Press and Communications Manager here at Witness, and we're really excited to have you today. As you all know, we're in one of the largest global election years in history. It affects 50% of the world's population. I woke up this morning to see the results coming in from India, and I know that that's shaken a lot of people in very interesting ways. And we're also in full swing of the next AI generated, AI modified, and AI influenced version of the internet. And that's left everyone at the front lines, like journalists and human rights defenders, as well as those at a systems level, such as policymakers and lawmakers, scrambling for solutions, scrambling to understand, and trying to figure out how we can counter mass disinformation and attacks on trust and truth. And Witness has been preparing for this moment and working on defending critical video and anticipating the impacts of deepfakes and deceptive AI for years. So we've invited a select few funders and allies here today to help make sense of this deeply complex issue and landscape, and particularly to center the concerns of communities who are most impacted by these technological shifts. And for that, we have with us Sam Gregory, who many of you know is Witness's executive director, award-winning human rights advocate, technologist, and an expert on the impacts of deceptive AI, synthetic media, and deepfakes. So we'll start off with a presentation by Sam. During that time, closed captioning will be on. So if you look towards the bottom of your screen, you can turn it on and off as you'd like. And after Sam's presentation, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask, your most burning questions, whatever has been coming up for you, seeing all of this play out. And for that as well, there will be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can input your questions. So I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to hand it over directly to Sam to get us started. Sam, you're muted.
Thanks, Fatima. Really looking forward to this discussion with folks and really excited for the questions after I finish the presentation. So let me just pull up my presentation. So I'm going to take some time today to talk about what is happening with deceptive AI and elections, but I'm really going to use that as a lens into the bigger issue of the progress with deepfakes, synthetic media, and generative AI and its impacts outside the headlines, particularly as frontline human rights defenders and journalists defend their realities and their truths and demand solutions from funders, from policymakers, from regulators that will protect the ability to be trusted online, and particularly those most vulnerable voices. So I'm going to aim to cover a number of areas in the next 25 minutes, just an insight into what's been happening. I think there's a lot of hype around elections and AI, dating right back to the start of this year when institutions like the World Economic Forum said this was going to be the year of misinformation and AI. Then I'm going to talk about Witness's leadership role in responding to that, how we ground our work, and based on that, what we see as the most urgent concerns and the most concrete recommendations for action. So it goes without saying at this point in the year that we have what is an omnibus election year. There's national elections impacting almost half the world's population. And, one of the key questions, as I mentioned, is, what's actually happening with synthetic media, with deepfakes, with this threat of the ability to more easily manipulate and create realistic synthetic audio, images, and video. And as Fatima said, we're at a very interesting inflection point in the year with the Indian elections just happened, but many more obviously very consequential elections coming up through the remainder of the year, from the EU to Mexico to the US to Ghana to many other countries across the globe. And what I'm going to talk about today, is primarily the areas in the blue and the white circles here. So I'm not going to talk about AI and machine learning writ large, or even generative AI writ large, but really this ability to create realistic looking content that might deceive. or that might help people communicate. And I'm going to talk about that range of usages that we're seeing in the elections this year to date. So I want to start with fakery. And as you know, the original sin of deepfakes and synthetic media in this set of technologies is non-consensual sexual images. And that is unfortunately still true as a predominant harm. The tracking on this globally sees a continuing escalation of this, targeting women and girls, including women in the public sphere. It has a chilling effect on participation. We've seen very specific examples in a range of countries targeting women politicians. Second one here is audio. Audio clones are trivially easy to make and are being deployed in a range of elections. On this screen, I show the example from the US of the Biden deepfake robocall from last year. And in many contexts globally, we're seeing the use of manipulated dubbing of lips and audio to have candidates do things like withdraw from elections, boycott, or propose voting for another candidate. And the example you see here is from a politician in Pakistan. That's outright deception, but there's also what two fellow activists in this space, Nigat Dad and Rumen Chowdhury, term soft fakes. That's kind of humanizing AI fakery, for example, with clones of Prime Minister Modi from India singing, or cuddly avatars of the presidential and vice presidential candidates, and now vice president and president-elect of Indonesia, Prabowo and Gibran, that disguise the reality that Prabowo is a former military general and serial human rights abuser, not a cuddly grandfather. Or also from Indonesia, the resurrection deepfake of former military dictator Suharto, recalled from beyond the grave to ask people to vote for his party. And this genre of resurrection deepfakes are being used in many different elections. And there's also the increasing use of synthetic media to expand political communication. And the reason I put the question mark here is, as we look at the use of synthetic media, there are a lot of gray areas where we're still trying to work out the rules and who will use this and abuse this. So, for example, here we have the creation of personalized clones of Indian politicians who can address you by name in voter outreach. And questions with that, of course, of do people understand, particularly in low literacy populations, that that is happening? Of images of politicians meeting with voter groups they never actually met with. Here, these are AI-generated images of meetings with children and farmers from a politician in India, or Imran Khan in Pakistan using a voice clone to address his supporters from behind bars. And in political speech, we have satire too, the cornerstone of free expression, of course, a heavy focus of witnesses' work over the years, and a core usage of synthetic media. So here I share an example from Taiwan of a faked Xi Jinping wishing goodwill to the Taiwanese electorate in advance of their elections. Hint, he didn't really. And of course, with all satire, those in power want to shut it down. So in the middle, I highlight how a young Indian man who used a voice clone to satirize a politician was prosecuted for doing so. And of course, AI-generated imagery is increasingly a part of participatory global campaigns for human rights, as with the All Eyes on Rafah image that spread virally just recently. And I should add a wrinkle here, that also what we're seeing a lot of is AI used as an excuse for plausible believability or plausible deniability, as a sort of get out of jail free card on compromising real footage that someone wants to dismiss. And I'll give an example of that we've encountered. This was from a case that came to a rapid response force that Witness runs, that I'm going to talk about in a moment, where an Indian politician was caught on tape saying something compromising and came out and said, this is faked. This is made with AI. And of course, he was able to trade on the gray area we have now around AI, the ability to say something like, you know, you've heard those songs with AI that combine Drake and The Weeknd, anything is possible. So globally, we see this pattern of people both using AI for a range of uses. So they use it to attack, to communicate, to deceive, to humanize, to resurrect, to ridicule. And they also use the threat and the plausible claim of AI to deny reality. And I think that's a really important thing from the perspective of people who work with human rights defenders and journalists who already have the credibility of their content constantly challenged, constantly dismissed. So one fundamental challenge here is protecting the integrity of the real, particularly as it comes from already marginalized voices. So I've given this snapshot of the AI and elections landscape, but now I want to back into where Witness sits in this and how we've been observing this and how we build our own base of knowledge on what's important. How do we make sense of this complex landscape, separate out the hype from the reality? And of course, as folks on this call will know, Witness's underlying mission is very broadly how to realize a vision of human rights for everyone through the tools of video and technology. How do we use these omnipresent technologies that are in people's hands, typically their mobile phone, their access to the internet, their access to social media, as a positive tool for human rights? And our work is global in scope, of course, spanning a range of human rights issues where we both work directly with communities who are fighting to defend the realities of land rights abuses, to confront war crimes, to defend against state violence, and to do that in a climate that is increasingly hostile to human rights defenders. We do that directly working with them in a very close way to learn with them, to secure advocacy impact. And we do that in a way that shares that knowledge very broadly, reaching approximately 3 million people last year with the skills and the capacities to do things like document under an internet shutdown or document video as evidence of environmental crimes. And the other part of our work that's really critical, and it's how we came into working on the space of AI, is that we also have been leading the fight against harmful AI-generated synthetic media, because we believe it's critical to be ahead of these emerging technologies in order to safeguard democracy and uphold human rights. And I'm going to tell you how we build our basis of information in order to then inform the recommendations and the advocacy and the direct work we do together with our partners on the ground, those human rights defenders, those community journalists who are the bedrock of human rights documentation and credible information on critical issues. So our work on this began in one sense in 2018, when we were the first global group to start doing genuinely inclusive convening work that brought people together from human rights, from technology, from civil society, to look ahead to this emerging threat from what were then known as deepfakes and say, what do we need to do to prepare, don't panic? And I say we started in 2018 because, of course, the roots of this work lie in defending the credibility of human rights footage for many decades before that. Witness is celebrating this year our 30th anniversary. And always we've had this challenge of how do you defend the critical stories, the voices, and the documentation of frontline activists and journalists. And our work, as I mentioned, is deeply grounded in consultation very closely with the people who should be at the center of identifying the harms and the needed solutions. And so we spend resources to bring people together to talk about what they're seeing, most recently in Brazil, in the coming months in Southeast Asia. And that's at the bedrock of our work. And we put that alongside a set of other activities. We do grounded research and we stay deeply in contact with the tech world. We know what's happening in terms of the technology developments in this space. And we do very practical work that supports frontline journalists and human rights defenders. We run the only global rapid response force for high-profile cases of deepfakery, as well as suspected deepfakes. And we run frontline training programs, providing journalists and human rights defenders with skills and tools, and developing shareable literacy approaches that can help reach other people. And then building on that, we're unusual, I think, in the sense that we also very directly do work on the technical standards that are setting the terms for how we trust a piece of media. How will we know when AI is used? And we engage on policy and advocacy at the highest levels. For example, testifying in the US House and Congress, engaging in the White House and at the UN. So that's how we make sense and stay grounded. And I think it's really important for Witness that we stay grounded in the direct work and the direct consultation, and then we help the communities we work with translate that into the systemic work that will set the infrastructure for whether they can be trusted in the long run and even in the next couple of years. So from that perspective, one question I'm often asked, and particularly in the last couple of months, is the hype around AI and elections this year all smoke and no fire? And in some sense, I think that's correct, but we should celebrate that, right? Like I've spent the last 7 years working with the Witness team on this, and every year I hope that this is the year where we don't have to have the full-scale fire, the full-scale harms from these deceptive AI formats. So we don't need to wish this upon ourselves now. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be acting. And so, you know, one way to think about this is, right, maybe we should keep calm. The sky is not falling, but it's really a question of whether the sky is falling yet. And the reason I say that is also because of what our technical analysis, our communication with experts, both from human rights and technology, tells us is, you know, we've got some pretty key shifts that are happening around the AI landscape that emphasize the need for really critical safeguards now that we need to insist upon, right? We have these tools getting commercialized, commoditized, easily accessible. They're very easy to use. They're easy to use to create a volume of audio and images. I could create audio clones of everyone on this call, given a minute of your voice. We're not going to ask for your voice on this. We're asking you to type it in, so I can't do that to you, of course. And then, of course, we have multimodality, which is this idea you can easily go from text to image, image to video, and increasingly you can personalize it. And all of these trends are getting more emphasized, right? And this is why we need to think about safeguards now, and we need to act now, is it's getting easier and easier to make realistic content, to tailor it, to manipulate it, and increasingly video is possible. And video bypasses many of the ways we try and create a layer between ourselves and, say, an image we see. And increasingly, this will be personalized, not just broadcast, but narrowcast to us individually. And we have open questions that we really don't know the answers to yet, but really force us to say, how are we listening to the people who are most likely to be harmed? How are we making sense of what's happening already as we get ready for some of these shifts, right? What will happen when we have an increased volume of this realistic AI-generated content? What happens when we have an increased quality or persuasiveness? What happens when it's increasingly localized or personalized? And what does that mean for trust overall? So thinking about all of that, what do we need to prioritize as solutions? I think that is the critical question that as witness, as funders, as allies, it's really important to focus on at this point in time. And so I'm going to share some of our recommendations and some of the ways we've been acting on some critical areas. It's not every area, but some critical areas that we've targeted. And I'm going to talk primarily, at least for the next maybe 5 or 6 minutes, about the areas of detection, transparency, and media literacy. So first, detection. And a lot of witnesses' experience around detection comes from the real world. We are not talking hypothetically about this. We've talked to journalists, we've talked to human rights defenders. And for years, even before the current explosion of deepfakes, they were saying, we are worried we will not have access to the tools, the skills to detect increasingly sophisticated AI-generated media. And it's one of the reasons we created this Deepfakes Rapid Response Force. It's the only global rapid response force that connects local journalists, fact checkers, and also human rights defenders to media forensics and deepfakes experts who contribute their research and their tools. And that's on the most high public interest cases where someone is struggling to work out whether something is AI or whether something is someone claiming it to be AI. Right? I mentioned earlier this example of the Indian politician claiming that a scandalous audio clip was AI-based. We brought that to the team. They ran a series of tests. They generated an individualized audio model of the politician's voice. They ran it against a massive machine learning algorithm trained on many different voices to conclude that it was, in fact, at least one of the 2 clips he was attributing as AI generated was almost certainly true. And we're getting cases from the Sudan, we're getting cases from India, we get cases from Venezuela, West Africa. And we're entering a messy world where even the experts in the task force are grappling to sort true from false, and where the ease of calling deepfake on something real is also increasing. And alongside that, what we see is what we describe as a detection equity gap. And what I mean by that is that the frontline journalists, human rights defenders, civil society leaders, who communities turn to and say, help me understand whether this is real or false, are the ones who are most disadvantaged in this space. They don't have access to the tools. The tools and the databases weren't designed with their languages, their realities in mind. And they're not getting access to the skills building and the escalation options they need. And when you start to think about that and you start to look at that volume question, you have a really quite nightmarish scenario starting to emerge. Think about that volume increasing. So it's not just those 5 cases, not just those 15 cases, it's 50 cases, it's 100 cases. The community leaders, journalists, and human rights defenders are being asked to confront and lack the tools and skills to do it or the resourcing. So the first thing that we point to very clearly in our space is the need to ensure the access to detection tools and skills for those who need them most, because this has implications for who is trusted and who can defend what is real. Now, there's a witness win in this space that I'm proud of and proud of the team's achievements. We've made this detection equity gap a critical part of the public conversation. We've been featured in over 100 media articles over the past year, and almost every time we're saying the gap here is around detection. It's about how do we focus on who needs this most, and we've made it part of the technical and policy conversations. And of course, we're providing this global rapid response mechanism, as well as pioneering training programs on AI-generated manipulation. The second area I mentioned was around media transparency and disclosure. The idea that we need to understand where AI is playing a role in the media we consume so we can distinguish between the outright fake, the thing that is trying to deceive us, that first category of election fakes I shared, something that is soft fakery that maybe we want to be amused by, or something that is genuine political communication or personal communication, where it being AI may be part of the equation, part of something we know, but doesn't deter us from engaging with it, consuming with it. It's all about understanding the recipe of how AI and human combine in what we encounter in an incredibly complex and increasingly complex world. Now, again, this area is not new to Witness. We were pioneers in the space of building tools, particularly with our partner, the Guardian Project, for verifying and creating verifiable media, such as proof mode. And even before the generative AI revolution, we published a report based on what we talked and learned from human rights defenders around the world about how to get this right. And so we've been incredibly well placed as this has gone from being a kind of niche discussion into a very mainstream discussion about how do we show people how a piece of media is put together? How do we show where AI and human mix together to create that video you see in your timeline, in your feed, or get sent in a WhatsApp message? And our attention to that was timely. This has become one of the focal points of companies and governments. It was the center of one of my testimonies to the US Senate. It's been a place where companies have been saying, we're going to disclose to the public how AI is used in communications around elections. And regulation like the EU AI Act has said you must have this disclosure and transparency. So this is happening, and it's an opportunity. This transparency, authenticity, and disclosure approaches are progressing. And they can provide these key signals, right? Wouldn't we all like to know when something has AI in it, when it might be used to deceive us? But it requires real nuance, real investment by governments, by funders, by the people who have power in this space to think about global accessibility, privacy, and unintended consequences. And I'll tell you a few of the things that we have been shouting from the rooftops when we've given testimony, when we've been inside technical processes to argue for what needs to happen. The first thing we say is, we've got to be really careful that this has to be about the how, not the who of AI human media making and information production. As we move forward, we need to continue to insist that our technologies protect privacy, are opt-in, and do not collect by default personally identifiable information. And that's critical as we protect both the citizen journalist in a context like Myanmar or Gaza, who needs to be careful about their voice and their identity being linked to the piece of media they create, the human media, as well as the satirist who creates a powerful piece of parody and, like that young man in India, is then targeted for speaking truth to power. And as we work on this, the role of organizations like Witness and allies and the way we telegraph and push what we've heard in the convening work at a local level and from frontline human rights defenders and journalists is think very carefully about the role of identity. Do we need to know who made something, or do we need to know how it was made? We need to think about who has access to these tools, and as a consequence from that, on whom is placed the burden of proof and truth, right? If you don't include a signal that shows how something was made, do you inherently get trusted less? Perhaps that's to do with your choices about security, your access to the right tools. And of course, really importantly, how can these technologies not be weaponized, right? As we look at the spate of fake news laws, the repression of civil society space, how do we make sure that tools that help authenticate media don't become a backdoor to tracking journalism, repressing freedom of the press, or tracking individuals? And I want to name a really notable Witness win in this space. Right since the beginning of the development of technical standards, we've been part of building technical standards, the underlying technical standards that will set the infrastructure for this. And we've done that with a focus on privacy, access, and the role of human rights defenders, and made sure that those are written into the way those standards are guided and directly into the technical approach. And so earlier this year, one of the key standards made a significant shift in which we played a key role to shift from a focus on identity to one that we see as much more privacy protecting. And so if that standard becomes the mainstream, we will have played a role in really echoing and reflecting a critical need we've heard from human rights defenders and frontline journalists. And of course, a key part of what we need to do is continue to do public education on regulation, on issues like transparency that reflects global perspectives and these human rights needs. The final area I'm going to talk in detail about is media literacy. Of course, often we're told that we should spot these little glitches. Maybe it's the sausage hands, maybe it's the glitch on the hairline or the deep fake that doesn't blink. And what I'm going to say here is We shouldn't do this. It puts all the pressure on the wrong people. It puts the pressure on us as individuals. It puts the pressure on people all around the world who have varying degrees of media literacy. We can't disadvantage the individuals by saying it's your job to spot AI fakery. So I want to be careful here. Often people say, well, surely we just need to help people spot this. And I want to add some nuance to that conversation from what we've learned. So what we've learned is don't teach people to spot the glitches. Don't tell them to spot the eyes that don't blink. And for the moment, don't point people to online detectors. If you look online and say, find me an AI detector, you'll find very quickly often they don't work or they give false positives and negatives. So instead, what we need to do is actually go back to a much more traditional media literacy, like encouraging people to do things like the SIFT methodology: stop, investigate the source, find alternative coverage, trace the original. And then we're going to bring in the signals that might start to come from those transparency approaches that might start to give us technical signals that go alongside that media literacy. And in a very concrete way, we're also trying to act on this. We're launching training programs that are grounding AI-generated manipulation in robust existing OSINT, that's open source investigation, and media literacy practices. So ground this in what we know already. Don't exoticize it. And none of this works. And I want to say this is a cornerstone of our advocacy, and it's learned so deeply from the experience of fighting, a battle that we've lost early on in many ways against the abuses of social media, right? We can't make that mistake again. All of these factors, including robust transparency, robust detection, the ability to have good media literacy that's supported by our engagement with content online, as well as liability for usages like that pervasive growing problem of non-consensual sexual deepfakes, depends on a pipeline responsibility. What I mean by that is, unless we think about where responsibility and liability sits right from the construction of those AI foundation models, their deployment into tools and apps, the way we engage with them on the platforms, often owned by the same conglomerates, that's what we need to emphasize. And so we need platform responsibility, but we need more than that. We need pipeline responsibility as an advocacy goal. And finally, I want to say something that's really fundamental to how Witness is thinking about it, is that we also know we need to reinforce the credibility, the truth, the reliability of those frontline human rights defenders and journalists. And there's an opportunity and a need here that we see, which is that we can lean into how we enhance the resilience, credibility, and innovation in human rights and journalistic practice, responding both to the harms I've noted, but also the opportunities. How do we use it to create better visualizations that are more accessible to more people to show what is going wrong, to anonymize people in humanizing ways, to produce more variety of videos and content that engage new audiences to care about human rights. So one of the things that with new co-leaders at Witness, like our new incoming programs director, Leandro Ramos, we're integrating a progressive focus on AI resiliency into all aspects of our work. So let me finish just by summarizing how we see some recommendations. First, principles for action. We need to center those protecting human rights democracy on the front lines, the harms they experience and the solutions they prioritize. We need to place firm responsibility across the AI tech and information pipeline. And all of this needs to be human rights based, from technical infrastructure to norms, to platform policies, to laws and regulations. And what to invest in? We have unknown questions right now. Those big questions about increased volume, increased personalization, increased quality. We need detailed information that helps us actually know how this is happening, that's grounded in the experiences of those frontline defenders. We need to have that access to the detection skills, tools, and escalation mechanisms for those who need it most. We need to invest in that journalistic and civil society capacity and resiliency in the age of AI. We need to build that infrastructure for media transparency done right. We need to legislate grounded in data privacy, human rights, and transparency. And we need to ensure that pipeline responsibility across the tech ecosystem and avoid the mistakes of social media. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for sitting with this initial presentation. And I'm super excited to have the chance to talk with you more about what is weighing on your mind and how we're grappling with this and what we're seeing from the sense-making and work we do across that spectrum, from the grassroots to the front lines up to the policy level and the technical level. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for that presentation. It's incredible and so informative as always. While we wait for the audience to start putting in their questions, I have two questions lined up, and you kind of touched a little bit on both of them in your presentation. because I think there are new questions that a lot of us have. But I guess what the first is if you could speak a little bit more about the fact that is this the AI election year that we've been, thinking about, that we've been warned about? And just maybe go into a little bit more detail about like what is that we are seeing, what it is that we're not seeing, and what we should be like prepared for now that we're like kind of halfway in it.
Yeah, and I've been through in the witness work and as an expert in this area, multiple sort of hype cycles around synthetic media and AI. They date back to
Hmm.
2018. You can find a headline for every year that says deepfakes are going to destroy democracy. And I think it's an easy media headline when the picture we're seeing is much more nuanced and progressive, right? So you've got a much more nuanced and progressive picture from an election like India, right? Like most of the deepfakes in India this year have been satirical or humorous.
Hmm.
There's a really powerful expressive purpose, but it's not quite the same as saying they are swinging the election in a decisive way. And so we've seen these patterns, right? Like the example of these last minute audio voices or these last minute lip sync dubs, potentially those have an impact on elections. But as I look at where we're at, I think there's quite a lot of hype, but I don't think that that's a reason to be complacent. I, in fact, think it means a lot of what happens this year on the policy making, the technical standards, and how we invest in frontline activists and journalists is going to shape years when perhaps unfortunately the media attention will switch off. We'll be like, we got through
Hmm.
2024, we're okay, when in fact 2025, 2026 will be worse because of these volume quality issues. And if we haven't invested in the things we need to across the pipeline of responsibility in these measures, then we're going to be even worse placed than we were before.
Hmm. So as a bit of a follow-up to that, what do you think are like concretely the needs that we're seeing directly from human rights defenders, and what should allies and funders be supporting if they care about defending global human rights, like in this age of AI and deepfakes?
So, the first thing, and this comes from, witnesses both engaged with people who are in the digital policy space, thinking about regulation and law globally, as well as at the grassroots. And it's this lesson learned from the harms of social media is the experimentation, frankly, with social media has happened on the global majority world. And we're now in a headlong rush potentially to create new technologies and policies around AI. How are we making sure they're human rights centered and globally focused, right? So there is a voice and participation demand that is absolutely critical to start with, right? And is a lesson learned from the inequities of tech policy making and the lessons learned from social media. And then there's a very direct, like, how are we being prepared and supported to deal with this as it starts to land in front of us? And I remember very clearly about 6 or 8 months ago, meeting around 400 people working on verification and fact checking from across Asia. And for a number of years, Witness had been de-hyping the need for the human rights defenders we work with and the journalists to learn how to do things like detect deepfakes because we believed we weren't yet in the stage where they were starting to become prevalent. And the people in that meeting said to me, we are now starting to encounter them and we feel very ill-equipped with the tools and the skills and the capacities. So there's a very direct tools, skills, capacities, resourcing question that sits alongside that voice and participation on policy and regulation.
Mhm. And I see that we have our questions rolling in the Q&A, and reminder for everyone that you can see the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to add something there. So our next question is, what do you see as the role and responsibility of platforms in the regulations of these increasingly sophisticated deepfakes, given the potential threats posed to elections?
Yeah, so I think platforms are both doing something and they're not doing something, right, in the current context. And so the place which we should hold them to scrutiny, but I think is promising is, commitments to try and make it easier to have media transparency, right? So many of the companies have committed to these standards for media transparency disclosure. They've started to label, it's a moving target, right? But they're trying to do that. They're trying to make it easier to explain what is happening with media transparency. At the same time, are they investing in building detection methods that are accessible in the way we've just described and are needed? Not as much as they could, right? They are often the drivers of research, of resourcing, unfortunately, at this point, to journalism and civil society to enable them. So how do they do that in a really robust way? And then fundamentally, there's a bigger question here that many of us are grappling with in this space, of course. a lot of this is through the mechanism of social media, how this is distributed. So the incentive algorithms of distribution, the incentives for distributing misinformation, disinformation, inciting context are still the same, right? And perhaps even more exacerbated in the AI era. So we need to keep asking those questions at the same time as we're dealing with this AI problem. But we also need to avoid getting trapped in this sort of paradigm around platform accountability. Yes, we need to hold Facebook, the platform, accountable, but we need to hold
Mhm.
Meta, the conglomerate, accountable for that pipeline. So I think that's really important to think about at this point. And then there are some problems that I think even the platforms don't know quite how to handle, which is they've no idea how to prove something's real if a rumor starts to spread on their platform where it's hard to distinguish between AI and real, right? They've become used, perhaps from the misinformation era, to saying this is fake, but they don't know. And I'm sure they'd feel very uncomfortable saying this is real. But that's actually one of the problems that we're encountering in the real world is people blurring the line between real and fake. So they have a whole new set of challenges that come from the blur around AI detection. And also perhaps increasingly this will become very personalized. So you won't see it on Facebook. It'll be coming in a very direct way in WhatsApp messaging in ways that are not exposed for very good reasons to platform governance because of encryption.
And I imagine like the problems we've already seen with hate speech and mis and disinfo, even that's not synthetic media, would also translate into synthetic media. So contextual clues, regional differences, linguistic differences, all of those.
Exactly, exactly. And what we know about AI systems for, that if you have not resourced them and you don't put the human contextual system around them and you don't resource adequately in the global majority, you end up with unfair and harmful outcomes, right? And, we've seen this already in our work around satirical deepfakes, which are like, an extension of an existing problem, right? The platforms have always done really badly in understanding satire because they've not invested in
Mm.
understanding what is culturally satirical and what is disinformation in a variety of countries they've not prioritized, and that's even harder to do when it's photorealistic, audio realistic satire. So just as an example, that's a place where you see how the failure to resource, the failure to put money into content moderation, the failure to provide contextualized local support perpetuates what we've seen before.
We have another question. We have a question from the chat. What advice would you give journalists covering the election to not fall prey to AI-generated voices and images and disseminate it before it's confirmed to be a fake? In quotation, and then they have think about the fake Mark Twain quote about a lie. It sounds like it takes a bit of time to confirm.
Yeah, and I think this is really critical. And it's something we've seen in our deepfakes rapid response force that sometimes it takes a while to make a confirmation. And that timeline can be improved. I think there are ways to speed that up. I think I would look at it in two ways, and this is relates to, some of the best practices also building from existing work on confronting existing forms of misinformation and disinformation. I don't want to exoticize some of this outside of it much. As you said, Fatima, right? Like these are existing problems here. This is not something that doesn't land on top of existing power inequalities and challenges for journalism. So there, for example, I think we're still in a sensationalization phase around AI, and this may not last, which is like the decision to publicize is really important, right? We know that often what people want is attention on something, and if you don't get attention, it doesn't travel, it doesn't have its impact. So I think there's an important part, which is with AI fakery, although it's very tempting to like write a news story on it because it's the sexy topic, do we actually want to give it attention and oxygen by doing that? So that's the first stage, is actually, is this newsworthy or is this not? Is it only newsworthy because it's AI, or is it newsworthy because it's actually having an impact in the world and we're going to magnify that? So I think that's the first step. The second is, I think we have to start thinking how we educate the public about the complexities of detection and building a strong relationship of trust about how that happens, right? As from working in the detection world, I know that probably the best detection tools are going to get to like 85 to 90% reliability. So journalists, let's assume we're in the US, talking about the US context now, should start thinking, how are they going to start explaining that to the public now that it might be 85 to 90%? Here's how we're going to explain around it, rather than making an assumption that you're going to be able to do all of that in the last couple of days before something. And then I think there's a role for other actors in this space to take a little bit of the weight off journalists. So for example, we see some quite specific forms of AI-based deception already occurring in certain settings, right? Like those sort of last day kind of like, I'm asking you not to vote, or you don't need
Mm.
to vote now. These are classic voter suppression strategies that predate AI. And there's a space there for public education, not just from journalists, but from election officials and others to really, provide a really focus. So don't make people panic about everything, but give them a reason to be a little more skeptical about stuff like that and to direct them to
Mhm.
authoritative information.
Mhm. And then another question that we have coming in is, what kinds of laws and regulations do we need around both the synthetic media issues and around generative AI more broadly?
So what we've said in our testimonies on the Hill and in other opportunities to provide testimony and public education to lawmakers on this, and there's a range of legislation that is being developed at the state and federal level in the US, and of course in every national jurisdiction globally, is first, there are some very concrete spaces where you can do targeted legislation to address known widespread harms. And the one that I will always insist that we point to first are non-consensual sexual images. And
Mm-hmm.
this is the place where so many activists now are really mobilizing to say enough of this, right? There's got to be better liability and responsibility around this. So that's a place where legislating very specifically makes sense. Also potentially around child sexual abuse material, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, generating just synthetic child abuse material, right? So there's very specific legislative spaces there where there's work that can be done. In general, on the big picture regulatory side, I think a very good building block is to think about this media transparency, to make sure that that is very accessible, is required. That's been part of the EU AI Act. And then also to think alongside that, how do you really, as I say, pick out the high risk scenarios? Again, something the EU AI Act has done, also what you're doing with non-consensual sexual images, and really focus on them and get them addressed very specifically. So media transparency, and honestly, in the big picture, this sits alongside issues of data privacy, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
have a real range of how jurisdictions deal with data privacy. The US very behind on that compared to others. And so much of this is also about your rights to data privacy when it comes to people's ability to create synthetic media about you, as well as to access information that might be used in generative processes like these training data sets.
We have just about 5 minutes left, so if anyone would like to pop a question in the Q&A, you could do that now. I have another one here. Um, Sorry, let me just read it out. What, if anything, can we as individuals do to better prepare and educate ourselves on spotting and deciphering deepfakes or other synthetic media? So I know you don't want all of the burden to be on end users, but if we are, while we're waiting for these platforms and governments and everybody to do the systematic things, what is it that we can do?
So now, Fatima, is when I ask you to spot the glitches in my face because I'm actually a deep, and I've been using an audio clone. But I'm sort of joking because I probably couldn't literally do this right now. My face probably would be a little more glitchy, but I could be using an audio clone. And like what I'm doing now is well within the possibility pretty soon to do pretty easily. And so the reason I'm saying that is I don't think trying to put the onus on individuals is very fair, particularly when they're in contexts where they're not expecting it, right? Like I got fooled by the Pope in the puffer jacket because I
Mm,
wasn't paying attention. I was just flicking through. I was like, oh, that's a very fly puffer jacket. Nice, nice, nice. So I don't think we can do that to people. I think we have to put our attention on the regulatory side, the technical infrastructure side, the onus on the platforms. And then if we're going to put attention on who we really resource to be structured to do this well, I would put it in those frontline defenders, those community leaders, those journalists, who people are going to turn to when it gets more complex to try and help them, right? And that's going to be traditional journalists and media sources, but it's also going to be community leaders and respected people. And that, for example, has been a focus of Witness's work on misinformation more broadly in West Africa, where we really focus on how do you support community leaders who are not just the traditional journalists or elected officials. And I think thinking in that broader way about who we turn to, how do we support them? And then for individuals, over time, we're going to get a better way to provide, for example, these signals that show you that recipe of how AI was used. And hopefully those will provide a complement to that much more basic media literacy that we need to continue to invest in for folks from the schooling level upwards.
mm. And I imagine even the signals that we will adopt for transparency will need their own kind of media literacy. So, like, how do you, for example, even when you were talking about detection, like, because a tool has said yes or no, but do you know, like, what does yes or no mean coming from that tool? So, lots to think about.
Lots to think about, and a lot of unsolved problems, but we shouldn't solve them without listening to the people who are on the front lines of the harms and listening globally, right? So totally huge unsolved problem. How do we communicate that recipe? But the only way we're going to get that right is if we listen to the people who are like, I have to communicate around this in situations of
Hmm.
trust, of confidence, and harm.
Hmm. I think we have time for one last question. So, yeah, we'll take this one. In your work with technology companies in this area, have you found that there is alignment in your priorities and vision?
I think it goes back to the question before that
Hmm.
there are places where there is going to be some alignment, right? I think we are aligned, for example, that we believe in media transparency, but we need to insist that it's done from a human rights basis, which is there as rhetoric for companies, and I believe is part of some parts of the company's philosophy and some teams, but it's not necessarily everywhere. And I think we have to be very clear-eyed that business models and incentives are not aligned necessarily with human rights, right? So how do we make sure we understand that? I do think it's worth getting the wins that matter, particularly now, right? A lot of this is being set down by regulators and tech companies. And as I said, one of the things that I find most challenging in my work, and I've worked in this space for close to 25 years, is the sense that we're constantly fighting that rear guard battle on social media, that we missed the chance 15 years ago to
Hmm.
really stand up for what we cared about. And now it's just, we're doing harm reduction. So I think it's really important now to engage, to challenge companies and to get regulation that enforces the things we care about, and that be human rights-based legislation that is grounded in global needs and harms.
Hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. Especially the bit about social media, because I think just on a personal level, this is something that I think about so much is that now what we're like talking about synthetic media, AI, and like more sophisticated mis and disinformation, but like the base level, like the really low quality, the what we call cheap fakes or just straight up misinformation and lies is also still happening. And we haven't fully really addressed that. And now we're like over here, and now it's happening side by side.
Yeah, they're both going to sit there, and it's the thing, and I didn't point it out in this presentation, but I think in every time I've talked about this for the last 5 years, I say to people, look, cheap fakes and shallow fakes often are effective, and they're still what people do. And so I think it's also about not exoticizing the problem away from the reality of why people do this and the motivations,
Hmm.
or the fact that some of the mechanisms may not be about AI, right? They may be about, media literacy, or they may be about platform incentives, and those would apply to both shallow fakes and deep fakes.
Hmm. I think we're out of time there. So thank you so much, Sam, for your time. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We'd love to continue this conversation. You could always reach out to us. You can reach out to me if you want, Fatma@witness.org. I'm the press and comms manager. And of course, you can reach out to Sam. You can reach out to other members of our team. We'd love to hear the questions that you have and the way that we can all move forward on this. So yeah, I just want to thank Sam. Is there anything you would like to close off with?
No, thank you, Fatima, for coordinating this. And we really want to see how we can mobilize resources, attention, and action. This is going to be a critical year. Even if the AI election year doesn't happen, this is a critical year for acting on AI as both a threat and perhaps part of the promise of doing effective journalism, human rights, and having a resilient global society.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, thank you, everyone. I think we'll end on that note. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.